Hello, everybody. I'm Maxime Bernier. I'm in Ottawa right now with one of my guests. I'm very, very pleased that he's with us, Brian Petford. Brian is the only fathers of our Charter of Rights that is still alive, still with us. And we must know what happened in 1992 when we decided in Canada to have a Charter of Rights. And Brian was one of the premier. He was at that time premier of Newfoundland and part of the negotiation. And I think it's important for our viewers, for Canadians, to know a little bit about that part of our history here in Canada. Brian, thank you for being with us. I really appreciate that. You've been fighting for freedoms and for our country for a long time.
Thank you, Mr. Bernier, for having me. I should say thank you to my leader for having me, because I'm a member of your party and a strong supporter of you and the principles that your party stands for. And yes, I was a part of that very historic time in 1991 and 92. And I think what your supporters and the viewers would be very interested in is the question that you just asked about a little bit of the history of that time. I think it's not well known that these negotiations went on for 17 months that led to the Constitution Act of 82, in which the Charter of Rights and Freedoms is located. Okay, the Charter is in the Constitution Act of 1982, and it was 17 years. And it was Justin Trudeau's father, who was Prime Minister at the time. And why it took really 17 months was we had a lot to talk about, and putting together the Charter, as well as other matters that dealing with Indigenous people, dealing with equalization, dealing with natural resources. So the minority language rights were all part of that big act. But the main part of the act was that Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Well, halfway through those negotiations, Justin's father up and left the table and said, I cannot negotiate with you people. You're too difficult. And he took his marbles and went home and went to the House of Commons and passed an act to unilaterally bring the Constitution home from London, patriation, and put in his own Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And we challenged
So without any more consultations?
Without any more consultation, he said, I can do this on my own. And so he passed an act in the House of Commons, had it ratified in the Senate, became the law of Canada, and he was going to go to London and have all of this done on his own, just the federal government. We took him to court in 3 provinces of Canada, in Newfoundland, in Quebec, and in Manitoba. And of course, that put the pressure on him. We said, you cannot do this alone. This is a federation. This is not a unitary state. It's made up of provinces and the federal government. And so we took him to court. That ended up in the Supreme Court of Canada in September 1981, where Mr. Trudeau lost. His own friends on the Supreme Court of Canada said, you cannot do this. You need to have a majority of provinces with you to do this, to pass a new Charter of Rights and Freedoms, to patriate the Constitution, to have the Constitution Act of 1982. You can't do it alone. So today, I am very, very angry when I see a Charter of Rights and Freedoms with only one signature on it. Because Mr. Trudeau's Charter of Rights was defeated by the Supreme Court of Canada. The Charter of Rights that was passed was the Charter of Rights of 9 premiers and the Prime Minister of Canada. So there should be 10 signatures on any Charter of Rights in order for it to be constitutional. So we went back to the table after the Prime Minister lost. He came back to the table with his tail between his legs, although knowing a Trudeau, they don't have a tail between their legs very long. They're quite aggressive, arrogant people, and they believe that their way is the right way, and everybody else's way is not very correct. But back to the table he came, and out of that we negotiated what is now the Constitution Act of 1982, okay?
With a Charter of Rights.
With a Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And how did we get it? 3 days in November 1981. November 3rd, 4th, and 5th. No deal on the 3rd. No deal all through the day of the 4th. The night of the 4th, my delegation and I did a 2-page compromise proposal. took it to the Chateau Laurier Hotel, to the Saskatchewan suite, and asked representatives of British Columbia, Alberta, and Saskatchewan, what do you think of this, based upon where we came in the last 2 days? Does this have a chance to fly? They looked at it and they said, you know what? We think it does. We think you might have just hit upon those areas where the provinces can move a little bit, the federal government can move a little bit, and we can have a deal. So we brought in Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island and Manitoba. And you might have heard in reading our history that this was supposed to be the night of the long knives, where we were stabbing Quebec in the back because they weren't at that suite that night. Well, guess what happened?
Quebec was in Hull.
Exactly. Yeah. We knocked on their door, no answer. We've called their numbers, no answer. Where were they? They were all over partying at a restaurant in Hull. So that's why they weren't there. There was no night of the long knives. So all that history that's been written is completely mythical and untrue. However, through that night when we finalized that deal, through that night, we had agreed that we would all meet the next morning for breakfast. Now, that breakfast was already scheduled because when Mr. Trudeau left the table, the provinces broke into two factions. 8 were against what the Trudeau was doing. 2 stayed with Mr. Trudeau, New Brunswick and Ontario. So it was a group of 8. So when we went to the conference on the 3rd and 4th and 5th, we were meeting every morning at 8 o'clock before.
And at that time, René Lévesque, did he know that you had a deal? Or
well, that night, he was called when he got back, and we said, we will have the deal for you tomorrow morning before we meet the group of 8. You'll see it. We'll give it to your officials, and you can read over and see what you think of it before we formally meet as a group of 8 and see what you think of it. So he was at that meeting that morning of the 5th of November with his delegation, and Peter Lougheed actually, when René Lévesque came in the room, said, René, here it is. Remember I called you this morning. Here's and he called it at that time the Peckford recommendation. That's what Lougheed himself called it, because it was based on the Newfoundland proposal that we had gotten this final deal. And so we gave them time to take a look at it, and then we all debated it together.
Without Trudeau in the room. Without Trudeau in the room.
Without Trudeau in the room. Yeah. That's right. Before we went to the main meeting, Trudeau wasn't in the room, just a group of 8.
Yeah.
So all of them looked at it, including René, and René said, I think, by the way, if left to his own devices, René would have approved it. Oh. I think, this is me, and I have good reason to say this, which I can't release, I have never released, but I know that Mr. Morin and Mr. Parizeau, who were part of his delegation, were very strong Quebec nationalists, as you know better than I.
Hardcore independentists,
Exactly. Hardcore independents. And they were his advisors at the time. I knew Mr. Lévesque well before, that. I knew him from the time I was Minister of Energy in Newfoundland, I dealt with him before. So I knew René Lévesque really, really well. I think if left to his own devices, he would have went along with it. But he wasn't alone. Yeah. And so these people were powerful, powerful voices in the party and in the government. Yeah. And so they said no. Everybody else in the room, the other 7, said, unamend it, go with it, like you did it last night, like you got it before us now. We don't want to amend a thing. And we'll present it to all 11 governments at a scheduled final meeting later that day. Yeah. And you, Mr. Peckford, will present it because you started this last night.
Yeah, that was your proposal.
Yeah, exactly. And so we adjourned the meeting, went to the full meeting with Trudeau, all the federal people, and the Ontario, Manitoba, New Brunswick, and everybody there. And Mr. Trudeau spoke up after the meeting got going and said, and here was his words, I understand, Mr. Peckford, you have a proposal to present. Because before the meeting started, we had our people go up to his people and say, Mr. Peckford has a proposal to present on behalf of the 8.
So Trudeau changed the agenda to be sure that you'll be able to present it.
Exactly. And so he asked me to present it. I presented it, and all of this is in my book, all these different proposals in the book that I wrote, which demonstrates, we're going from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, boom, with a few changes, not a lot, a few changes in equalization, a few changes in the wording on Aboriginal, no changes in the charter. The charter that we presented that day is the charter you have today as part of the law and Constitution of Canada.
With the clause 1,
Which section
so
1 is.
section 1? Okay.
Yes.
Because
Oh,
you're
yes.
going to speak about section
Yeah.
1. I want to know a little bit more details about that
And
section.
I'm very eager to provide them. So
Okay,
that's the
so go ahead.
history
Yeah.
for your viewers as how the Constitution Act of 82 happened and how the Charter of Rights came to be.
I think it's very important to know that, we have that. It's not the Trudeau's Charter of Rights.
Exactly.
It's Canada Charter of Rights.
You got it.
And with all the provinces. So,
Absolutely.
and, I'm very honored to have you and having this opportunity to have that discussion with you today. And but can you go on with the charter
Yes.
and the details in the charter?
Yes.
Because, we are actually in the middle of a
Yes.
COVID hysteria and
Right.
we are losing our rights and freedoms all
Right.
across the country.
Okay.
You are in Ottawa today because of
Right.
that convoy
Exactly.
and that we support, the Truckers Freedom Convoy.
Okay.
And people are fed up and are mad about the situation in Canada.
Right.
And we are supposed to have a Charter of Rights, but our politicians are not respecting our Constitution and
Right.
our Charter of Rights.
Right.
I had a lot of questions the last 2 years.
Yes.
Maxime, we must change our Charter of Rights or change our Constitution because, we don't have any rights anymore. And my answer was always the same. You don't need to change. We have a great Constitution, a great Charter of Rights. You need to change the politicians.
Exactly.
The problem is the politician.
And that's why I'm a member of your party. That's why I support you today. For what you just said is what I've been saying now for the last year and a half. You said it long before me, but that's exactly right what you just said. Now, so I make 4 points for you to help on that. Charter of Rights and Freedoms, okay? First principle is this, that every Canadian must know that Section 52 of the Constitution Act says the following. The supreme law of Canada is the Constitution. So every Canadian must know that the Charter of Rights and Freedoms is the supreme law of Canada as it affects individual rights and freedoms. It is the supreme law. Every bylaw in every municipal council, every law in every provincial legislature, every law in the federal parliament is subservient to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It stands on high above all others, okay? The supreme law of Canada is the Constitution, is the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Number 2, I want to say, is that the first words in our charter is not section 1. It is, whereas this country is founded on the principles of the supremacy of God and the rule of law. And after that sentence, there is a colon, a grammatical colon, not a period. It's a colon, which means everything comes after this.
Yeah.
In other words, the charter is to be interpreted under 2 principles, supremacy of God and the rule of law. And that's been ignored by a lot of courts today. And we must bring them back to what is in the, I'm not talking about what should be in the Constitution.
It is.
I'm talking about what is in the Constitution.
Yeah.
These are words that they're supposed to read and interpret, right? When they're interpreting law under the Constitution and under the Charter. Okay. That's 2 points. Now, 3 points. Two more points. Here are the main parts of the Charter which apply to you and me and to individuals all across Canada. Okay. Section 2, which is freedoms. The freedom of conscience, the freedom of religion, the freedom of expression, the freedom of thought,
Freedom
okay?
to travel.
Freedom of the press, okay? In Section 2. Also in Section 2 is the freedom to assemble, like you were doing in Manitoba.
Yeah.
Right? Freedom to associate, as you were doing in Manitoba,
Yeah.
as a citizen of Canada when they arrested you. Section 6 says the freedom to travel anywhere in Canada or leave Canada. Like you and I now can't travel.
Yeah.
As part of your work as a leader of a political party, you can't go everywhere in Canada because you're denied the same rights as other Canadians because you've chosen a certain course of medical ethics, and now you're stopped from doing that. That's violating that Section 6. Then there's Section 7, which is every Canadian has the right to life, liberty, and the security of the person. Life and liberty are glorious, right?
Yeah.
Sacred words, right? In any constitution. But we'll emphasize security of the person now for obvious reasons. Security of the person, like I said in my speeches in the last few days, means you cannot touch my body unless I agree. Autonomy of the individual, security of the person. So all of these coercion efforts by the government to try to get people to get injections violates that section of the Charter, security of the person. And finally is Section 15, which is every Canadian has the right to equality before the law. You and I are supposed to be equal before the law. In other words, we're supposed to be able to go anywhere in Canada, do anything we want, just like everybody else. Right now, we're not being able to do that, and therefore Section 15 is being violated.
Vaccinated or not. Yeah.
Exactly. Now, we come to the bothersome part that Canadians have. And this is what I really want to clarify. I was there. I know. I have a good memory. And I know. Section 1. We had to put that in because we're putting this in the Constitution, not a federal act, not a provincial act. This is in the Constitution of the country. Might be
the supreme law of the land.
The supreme law, and might not be changed for generations. Yeah. So over those many generations, there could be an insurrection, there could be a war, could be peril to Canada, right? Yeah. So governments must be willing to act quickly if it's in a very, very serious situation. So what we meant when we put in Section 1, that it could only apply in a very unusual circumstance, like the peril of the state. The state existence was in peril, war or insurrection. I remember when we debated it. Yeah. I remember when we talked about it.
So what is the wording of Section 1?
Section 1 says that the governments have the right to override all of the rights I just talked about and the freedoms I just talked about.
In a free and
But I'll come to that. Yeah. So, number one, my argument is that Section 1 doesn't even apply in this circumstance because the virus, 99% survival rate, less than 1% fatality rate. Yeah. That's not a threat to the state. No. Therefore, Section 1 doesn't apply. Okay? So fundamentally, Section 1 doesn't apply. But I'm a fair man. I'm a fair guy. Okay. Let's say it does apply. Okay. You have 4 tests to meet, even if it does apply in war, insurrection, or peril to the state. And those 4 tests are, you have to demonstrably justify. And I remember us debating, why are we we got justify in there. Why put in demonstrable? Because we want to ensure that the government's got to go out of their way to prove that they can override these rights and freedoms. They're so precious. So we put in demonstrably justified. Now, in anybody's reasonable interpretation of demonstrably justified, you have to demonstrably justify that the benefits outweigh the costs. Yeah. What government has done a cost-benefit analysis of their measures? Not one in Canada, not one. Mm-hmm. So they don't meet test number 1, absolutely, even if it did apply. Then by law, well, that means a new law. Where's the new law? They're operating under existing laws. Yeah. No new law, no parliaments involved. Yeah. Okay? And then it has to be done reasonable limits. But the limits keep changing. Every month or every few weeks, another public health officer is out with another new, goalposts.
Yeah,
right?
They told us 75% of the population will have the vaccine. Exactly. That will be the end of everything. And after that, 80% no.
So where's the reasonable limits? So they don't meet the test of reasonable limits. And the last one is the real copper fastener one for you and me and people who are advocating freedoms, okay? Because it's this. Those 3 must be done in the context of a free and democratic society. Now, what does a free and democratic society mean? It means, we better get our parliaments involved. We have 14 parliaments in this country, and all of them are closed most of the time that this pandemic was on. Was there any parliamentary committee formed? Right? Did the people's representatives have any say over any of this? Of course not. And so therefore, those 4 tests were not even met, even if Section 1 did apply. That's why the Charter is still valid today, why you and I are up talking to Canadians to say, you still have Charter rights because they did not meet the conditions of Section 1, even if it does apply.
So what you're saying, every draconian measure that they imposed to us the last 2 years were illegal and unconstitutional.
Absolutely. Totally. And that's where we have to stand, right? This is the first big test of our Constitution. Right? We had the BNA Act when? 1867.
Yeah.
When was the next Constitution Act? 1982.
Yeah.
Right? 114 years later. Right?
Yeah.
Well, big stuff.
Yeah.
And you mean to tell me 40 years after that, we're suddenly going to kneel down and say that all of these principles and sacred values of our country are going to go down the drain because somebody in their own mind determined that it was an emergency? They never went through the proper parliamentary procedures, never went through the proper tests, right, of demonstrably justified. No. You're not going to take those charter rights. Remember, the Americans formed their country in 1776. In 1791, they had a Bill of Rights.
Yeah.
Our country was formed in 1867. We never had a written Bill of Rights until 1982.
Yeah.
And somebody's going to tell me as a Canadian now, you're going to steal my individual rights and freedoms away over something that you've concocted on dubious science? No. We must fight this, and we must win this so that the Charter is still alive and well, and we have a democracy in this country.
So I always said that there's two battles in what is happening right now. The battle to change the public opinion.
Yes.
And as a politician, that's what I'm trying to do. And if we have more people on our side, that will put pressure on
Yes.
these authoritarian governments.
Yes.
And there's the battle in the court.
Yes.
So, and that's an important one.
Yes.
And I know that you have a case with the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms because you cannot travel across the country by plane like me, and you are suing the federal government for
Right.
that. It's against your charter, your rights
Right.
to travel across the country freely.
Right.
How do you see the result of all, and there's other cases all
Yes.
across the country
Yes.
in from court right
Yes.
now. So how do you see the result of all these cases?
Okay.
Do you think we're going to win that only at the Supreme Court, or
Okay.
how do you?
Okay.